Hello everyone and welcome to our panel discussion series here at It's Time. It's great to meet all of our amazing speakers today. We're going to introduce them in a little bit. My name's Kendal Archer. I'm the engagement manager for the Planet Mark, or a sustainability certification that helps companies cut carbon. In this session, we're going to be talking about where we are in the climate crisis and where we need to be. And as I mentioned, we're joined by four incredible speakers. So we've got Alan Mahon, Managing Director of Brewgooder, friendly wave, Bernadette Vallely, author of Your Planet Needs You, Chris Redston, Executive Director of Rainforest Trust UK, and Tony Burdon, CEO of Make My Money Matter. So an amazing panel. Welcome all. Thank you so much for being here. We are going to get stuck right in with some questions, and I'm going to start off with a question for Chris. So Chris, where are we at right now? So what is the current outlook with regards to climate change and what progress has been made so far?
Kendal. Well, we're clearly at a critical point in human history. As Sir David Attenborough said recently, what we do in the next few years will profoundly the next few thousand years. So the efforts we make to reduce climate change in this decade will be the most important things we can do for the planet. There's consensus among climate scientists that reducing our greenhouse gas emissions won't be enough to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 Celsius as laid down in the Paris Agreement. That ship has sailed, unfortunately. And I think that means that the gap needs to be bridged by finding ways to draw down greenhouse gases that have already been released into the atmosphere. So I believe we should be focusing far more effort and funding on what are called natural climate. Okay, these are solutions based on the planet's existing ecosystems. So we're talking about grasslands, mangroves, wetlands, peat bogs, kelp forests, swamps, coral reefs, marshes, soil system, and of course forests, particularly rainforests. These are the natural tools we use to repair our broken planet. Nature's often portrayed as a victim of climate change, but it should also be seen as a solution. Because a recent states that around 1/3 of the greenhouse gas mitigation required between now and 2030 can be provided through natural climate solutions. But this area is often ignored in climate change discussions. And although 1/3 of greenhouse gas mitigation can be produced by natural climate solutions, only 2.5% of funding goes towards these solutions. You know, there's always talk about science developing a wonderful new device that can be used to suck carbon out of the air and store it or turn it into something useful. But we already have these. They're called trees.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, a really lovely summary, and actually kind of in terms of the progress been made so far, some really some solutions there as well. I'm going to invite the rest of the panel to contribute on that question. So where we're at right now with the current outlook with regards to climate change and what progress has been made so far.
Perhaps I can speak about trees just to follow on from Chris, because it's timely. You know, our tree planting in Britain has been lamentable. And even though there's a small concession and a new amount of trees are going to be planted, I think nothing short of a national tree planting campaign. We have to really plant native trees as often and in as many places as we can. I think it's critical. It's 40 years it will take for them to absorb a whole ton of carbon, but it's worth doing. Yeah. So I agree with everything that Chris has said.
Maybe to add on my side, I think that, you know, as soon as you describe this as a climate emergency, my mind immediately starts thinking, well, it's urgent. We need to act quickly now. So, you know, it's interesting seeing more businesses and more governments make broad commitments to net zero by 2050. But what's really key, as Chris said, is what happens, especially over these next 10 years. This next decade is absolutely fundamental. So the urgency is around seeing what those commitments look like every year, you know, for the next 10 years. And then we'll really see whether we're going to deliver the change that's needed. and then we can hold those businesses and those governments to account for their promises.
I would kind of like to obviously echo what everyone is saying with a kind of a philosophical maybe look at it, I guess. I'm going to butcher a quote by Goethe, the sort of German poet, who said that more or less where the danger is, the saving power also comes. I think the most honest we can be with the scale of the emergency, of the disaster that's kind of impending, the more we can actually get to grips with the solutions. And the fact is, we're dealing with a natural disaster that's unfolding, albeit incrementally and sort of for many people, not quite in front of their eyes, but that we have solutions that are either high tech or low tech. I think if you were to understand the biology of a tree, you would also consider it pretty high tech for what it does. But that those saving powers are really they're at hand. So the high tech and the low tech. It's just how we gather together, like Bernadette said, and if we approach health on a national basis, if we approach education on a national basis, why can't we actually approach a campaign that brings people closer to those solutions like tree planting that people would get engaged with? So I think we're at a dangerous but also an exciting time to grasp the nettle.
I would agree, and I think that feeds nicely into every element of the other conversations. And I think the people, technology, and nature, the triple approach really comes through strongly as a theme there. And as well, of course, I know Tony, you mentioned the next 10 years are in the decade of action, so really is critical. So actually that feeds really nicely into the next question about what do we need to be aiming for. So we know that the IPCC targets advise that we should be aiming for net zero by 2050. But what does this look like in real practical terms? And I'm going to put that question to Tony.
Well, if you think of the definition of that, it's, human-caused greenhouse gas emissions are then balanced out by taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So if there's any remaining emissions, they're taken out by things like forests, as Chris described. So we're running a campaign on pensions. There's 3 trillion invested in the UK, 38 trillion pounds globally. So the financial system is a major driver of the climate emergency. And we're calling on all pension funds to be net zero by 2050, but in particular halving emissions by 2030 across their portfolios. So it's like Alan said, in a way, you've got this is both a massive challenge, but it's also a real opportunity as well. So if we can get agreement for pension funds to do this, and we're working with other organisations to make this law in the pensions bill, which is in the House of Commons now, if we can achieve this, then it will mean that investors from pension funds will then drive the companies that they have shares in to shift and reduce their emissions, for oil and gas companies to transition to becoming renewable energy companies, but for all businesses to reduce their emissions and become net zero businesses. But it will also force them to invest much, much more in green solutions as they try and rapidly reduce the emissions in their portfolio. So in a sense, I think that's what it looks like, but we've got to act now to make this something that pension funds and other bits of the financial system do. And for a lot of this, it's our money. It's our money in our pension, it's our money in our bank. So we do have power to demand that our money is used, not to destroy the planet, but to build a planet that we want to retire into.
Yeah, and just cutting in quickly on that, I think the incentives have to align, and there can be no greater incentive, on a fundamental basis than planning for your future financially, which in many respects plans for your future environmentally. There's not much point in having money on a planet which you would be better off, using it to keep dry or the physical gas, if you understand. You have to get from a consumer level and from an institutional level the real sense that what is spent and invested today will have a benefit for you in the future. And I think if you can make that as close to law or as close to convention as possible, then you're really starting to go through the gears in terms of change.
Absolutely. Chris, Bernadette, did you want to add anything on the real practical ways in which we...
I was thinking to add to Tony's, which is absolutely crucial, is where the money goes. It's always about the economics in the power. But 25 years ago, I took 20 minutes to change my energy provider to one that's 100% renewable. And so for 25 years, I've specifically, and without having to do a single other thing, got my electricity from renewable energy. That's an utterly powerful thing that I, as a consumer, can do, and everyone else can do very, very quickly. And if millions of people did that in a short space of time, the tide would be overwhelming. And we know already that the big companies, Shell, Esso, they're advertising it now. They're transitioning themselves already because of the work that Tony's been doing on that bigger scale as well.
Thank you, Bernadette. Chris?
I agree. I've always been a bit sceptical about net zero by 2050 targets, which is often a phrase used by politicians and corporations as a reason to just kick the climate can down the road. As everyone's agreeing, it's what we do in this decade that's going to tip the balance, not 20 years from now. So I think net zero is a laudable aim, but I think we should aim to industries and countries and sectors as close to net zero by 2030, not 2050. And one area that is particularly important is how we manage our working land, how we manage our farming. I mean, the amount of carbon stored in soil is huge, but unsustainable farming practice means a lot of that's been lost. And so we really need to, change the way we do things. And while, of course, planting trees and protecting existing ecosystems like rainforests is absolutely vital. And as well as planting, there's an awful lot of energy and conversation about planting trees, which is fantastic, but it's just as important to stop destroying the very well-developed and sustainable ecosystems we already have, because that also impacts on the other kind of parallel crisis of the sixth mass extinction we're going through at the moment. Is if we're destroying rainforests and wetlands, then we're not just adding to climate change, we're also driving millions of species towards extinction. So saving what we already have has a in terms of healthy ecosystems, has a double benefit. It helps the climate and it also saves species. So as I said, I think Tony's absolutely right. It's where the money goes makes a huge difference. And investments and pensions, now more people are looking towards how we can direct those towards having a climate positive effect. There's an organization out there called Global Returns Project, which is looking at directing investments towards climate change, and there are groups like ARC 2030 and who's hosting this conference. So there are a lot of people out there doing a lot of good work, but I guess it just needs to be more and faster and be adopted on a national and global scale as a way of solving the crisis.
Absolutely. So maybe we should be changing that 2050 to 2030. And it sounds like the combined approach of financial, looking after the soil, our ecosystems, individual behaviours are all real practical things we should be doing to get there faster.
And just to split the difference on that, there's a film out currently called 2040 that shows how we can use simple low-tech solutions to save the planet. And if anyone hasn't seen it, please check it out, because it really opened my eyes when I saw it a couple of weekends ago.
Thanks, Chris. I will pop that in my to watch list. That's awesome. Cool. Thank you, everyone. So my third question, which so we've looked at solutions, we've looked at where we want to get to, but my third question, which is going to go to Alan. So what are some of the key blockers to progress towards achieving those IPCC targets and to progress in the climate movement in general? And then a tail end part of that question, how can individuals try to overcome them?
two questions for the price of one.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest blockers in the general move towards recognition of the problem, let alone tackling it, is actually could be removed from the system as early as Wednesday next week, or this week, sorry, which is Donald Trump and the Trump administration. The fact that they've pulled out of the climate accords, could actually be reversed, albeit we would have lost 4 years. But a Biden administration has the opportunity, I think personally, to grasp the nettle, as I keep saying, and actually make a green recovery part of the COVID recovery plans from an economic point of view. And it's the opportunity, like I guess Roosevelt had in the 30s with the New Deal, to say, we want to provide people with meaningful jobs and opportunities, which then go on to build better lives for their children and their grandchildren. And I think that a green recovery, or a Green New Deal, as it's often always referred to, is definitely possible when you remove that blockage. But I also think that maybe there are greater structural problems. We couldn't, it would be amazing overnight if we could just completely, leaning into what Bernadette says, we could just turn on all the, the green energy and get rid of oil. But that's not particularly realistic from how we experience every day. So what would happen to our cars and our transport? What would happen to just the logistics of supply chains around the world? Is there a way we can actually start to move in a direction which runs as close as possible to the timeline that we need in order to get our economy set up for that transition? If we're talking about 2030 here, we've got China has set a carbon neutral target of 2060. That's a generation afterwards, and this is arguably, without the United States being at the forefront of this drive, is completely inadequate. They have 50% of all global renewables in solar and wind plugged into their energy infrastructure, but they're still building 30 coal-powered fire stations a year, according to Daniel Yergin. So, this need for insatiable growth is also putting that 2030 target to 2060, because maybe that's what they think is realistic. And when it comes down to, what can individual consumers do, I'm sure there, everybody else in this panel is much more clued into that than I am. But I think it's the psychological barrier. This is an enormous problem. It's a extinction problem for us as a species, and as well as Chris had referred to, every other species that we can that we value. And I think that it's getting over that notion that they are powerless, because they do have power, whether it be through combined actions to switch into renewable energies for their home, et cetera, making their money work for a better climate, but also holding their government to account. And we'll probably live at a time where climate is not necessarily front of everyone's minds right now with COVID, but it will 100% be second or third to most people, if not the first. So we need to start to think of ways to empower individuals so that psychologically they're not faced with the enormity of a problem that they might shrink from.
Absolutely. And I think, and I know we've got our last question as well is going to be talking about what individuals can do. But Bernadette, I can see you keen to dive in there. Do you want to add something to that?
Well, I want to take what Alan said and develop it a bit further, because I really see that there is a gap and that's what's causing eco-anxiety or climate anxiety in people. People are understanding, they themselves, anyone can go online and read the IPCC report and get the lowdown on actually how bad it is. And they don't see our leaders stepping up and holding space for the population in a psychological sense and taking us through a journey where we can transition. And it's because our leaders haven't owned up to the truth yet. Not in this country, in other countries they have. And that's what gives me hope, because I can see, as you're talking about the transition in COVID, people are using it as a stepping stone in other countries to go right into a green economy and to really reduce the amount of fossil fuels that are being burnt. So there's a great deal of hope at the same time. But it is a psychological gap in our leadership that we have because our leaders are unable to communicate with ordinary people about what needs to be done, and they're not taking responsibility at all for it.
I lean back in there just for a brief second. I think we need, couldn't agree with that more. We have a dearth of leadership, I think, particularly in this country. And in the English speaking world, you know, there is a dearth of leadership, I think. But also, we, you know, like you said there, Bernadette, we can go and we can find out this for ourselves. The government is not really telling us that, but more and more people would consider themselves relatively climate aware. What we need is an honest conversation with our leaders. Things will hurt. It will hurt to transition. It will not be perfect. It will not be smooth, but we need to be leveled with. And if COVID is anything to go by, we are not being leveled with around this.
Absolutely.
You can see all the countries that really had COVID, honesty and truth as the foundation of how they dealt with the population around them and how they came out of it better. Already they have less deaths. They were honest, they were fast and expedient and properly managed the situation as a crisis rather than pretending it wasn't really happening.
So we've got to demand better from government. That's the thing. I agree there are real challenges there. So, you know, we've got COP26 will be hosted by the UK next year, and the whole world spotlight will be on Britain and this government's leadership. So I do think that's an opportunity for them to do better and be on the world stage and show that. So, you know, one of the things, if we can, for instance, get it mandatory net zero by law in the pensions bill, the UK would be the first country to do that. So, you know, so that's the kind of thing I think we should be encouraging from government. The UK, you know, on wind power is a world leader. On batteries is one of the top leaders. So it's sort of, we've got to encourage politicians as well as knock them around the head. So I think somehow we've got to organise better as a community, as a society, to put pressure on government to do much more. So we all need to work together as organisations and individuals to think about how we do that and just put the pressure on.
Feeds into the positive psychology piece as well, because we always hear the doom and gloom, but actually to talk about the successes as well and what we're leading in and what the opportunities are is a really powerful thing for getting individuals on board across the UK and beyond. So, yeah. Chris, did you want to jump in on this? We've spoken about blockers. I'll speak them back to you in a minute, but did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with the other speakers on all the points raised, and I think that particularly that we all kind of in a Greta and become activists in some way and make our voices heard. I think it's also, you know, with all things, it's a matter of following the money. The world's governments currently spend $10,000 a minute subsidizing fossil fuels. So even if we were just to remove that or some of those subsidies, it would level the playing fields and allow renewable energy to really kind of take over in the way that it needs to. And of course, you know, another barrier towards progress is in the 3 years following the Paris Agreement, the 5 largest oil and gas companies invested over $1 billion on climate denial lobbying and misleading climate-related branding. So they obviously see the writing on the wall, and they're trying to slow things down as much as they can. And in terms of coming back to natural climate solutions, is you know, particularly short term, like protecting the carbon sinks that exist on our planet. That, as I said earlier, we only 2.5% of funding for climate change goes towards natural climate solutions, and a lot goes towards things that never really kind of come to light as a proper solution. So I think a fundamental readjustment of where the money we do allocate to fight climate change goes is really long overdue. But I also, you know, I have grounds for optimism, because I think, I mean, again, particularly this year, I think far more people are being aware of the situation. And although we are facing the the COVID pandemic at the moment, that many people are aware of, the deeper crisis of climate change and the climate emergency that certainly has not gone away. And also COVID has, because of it's a virus that's come from the natural world, and it really emphasizes that the destruction of the natural world, is causing us problems just with climate, but with releasing viruses like COVID and SARS into the human population. So the message is clear: we really need to protect our natural environment, not just for its own sake, but for the sake of humanity.
Absolutely. And I think you start to see how everything's interconnected and interlinked, and just with taking notes on what you all contributed there. And they do just all interweave in terms of the blockers, but also the solutions. So just some of the blockers we spoke about and answered that question. So politics, needing leadership from the top, just the practical infrastructure, Alan, you mentioned, money, the whole economic system, as well as mindset. So not always, everything often being framed not necessarily in a positive way. So actually some of the blockers are also some of the solutions there. Did anybody want to add anything else on that question? Because I know we've been talking about kind of some of the solutions to those blockers, but the final question that we're going to end on is about individual behaviours. So before we put that question to Bernadette, I wondered if anyone wanted to contribute on that blockers point more broadly before we move on.
Maybe just one thing to add. What's really interesting is that you can see now with the finance industry, you can get better returns if you invest in businesses that have high environmental, social, and governance standards. And this has been proven this year, last year, the past 5 years, the past 10 years. So one of the blockers has been, oh no, you can't tackle climate because we're going to lose money, or we need to invest and just make returns, just make money, and that's all we can think of. But actually, you can make money and you can do good at the same time, and that's proven now. And so I do think the blocker has been, profit at all costs, but the solution will be you can actually make profits and do good at the same time, and that's what we need to shift finance to do.
Absolutely.
I completely agree with that, Tony. I think that, and I think we're seeing far more very positive action coming from the private sector in that way, that is perhaps now leading rather than following government policies around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen businesses lead the way as well, specifically as well this year. I feel like this is something we talk about at the Planet Mark a lot as well. I'm keeping my eye on the time as well, so I'm going to lead on to our last question, but please dive in, because I know there's lots to be said on this. So yeah, if you want to contribute anything else, please just dive in. But the last question, which I'm going to put to Bernadette, so what are the most important and effective ways that individuals who are concerned about the climate crisis can have an impact?
Well, leading on from what we were just talking about, remember that consumers and companies are about 5 years ahead of laws being passed in Parliament. They're generally the ones that are pushing forward and making new products, and the consumers are wanting new innovations that are more ecological. That's what really drives it. And this idea that our politicians are sitting trying to work it out, they're being forced to do it by the likes of the United Nations, but also by consumers. So there's a power there that is not necessarily recognised, but I've seen it in different work and campaigns over scores of years, and I can prove that makes sense. I think as an individual, we can do so much. There is no excuse anymore. The books have all been written, the encyclopedias are all there. But in terms of what are the most important areas to cover, one is, where's your money going? Are you are you investing in a pension fund that you truly don't believe in, or you do? Is your biggest bill, your energy bill in your house, is that going towards renewable energy or something else? Are you aware of where your money's going and how you're investing on every level? Because you're responsible for that. Nobody else is. Yes, plant trees, but if you're a lazy tree planter, do what I do, although I have planted trees, obviously, go on Ecosia and make that your search engine. It takes, 2 minutes, and there you are. You're literally planting trees, and you can see the ticker tape going up all the time. So you're part of something bigger than just yourself, and you're part of a really, really good project. That's an example of a project. And, give everyone trees for their birthdays rather than buying plastic stuff that's from another country, perhaps. So yes, change your consumer habits. The next important thing I'd like to say is your attitude to animals matter. And the sixth extinction, which is going to be a biological catastrophe if we do not take hold of it, needs us to wake up on another level psychologically to the harm and the torture and the horror that we are causing animals from the tiniest to the biggest all over the planet repeatedly, from everything from industrial farming, which is causing havoc and is an environmental catastrophe in terms of climate, but also in terms of the land and the ecosystem, the biodiversity, everything. Your relationship to animals is unconscious in the main. But people are spreading insects on their eyes to make glittery eyeshadow, or crushed up beetles on their lips for red lipstick. We have unless we're conscious of it, we don't realize that our everyday life, the creams we're using, the products in the kitchen and in the bathroom, our lives are intertwined with animals, and it is now at an industrial scale that is causing this species extinction. When the fields around here are sprayed, I know that the hedgerows become endangered, the creatures in the hedgerows are endangered, and the water and the whole ecosystem is affected because the sprays, because of our continued cheap food with chemicals and toxins sprayed all over them. So we're destroying the ecosystem and the animal kingdom in ways that are very unconscious, and we need to wake up to that. And lastly, but not least, make a positive contribution, make your soil better. Creating better soil, using composting everything, making the soil around you in your garden, in your local area, just concentrating on upgrading the environment rather than destroying it in every single way that you can. I could tell you 5,000 things that you could do to make your environment better, but the first thing you have to do is take a step forward and say, okay, I'm an earth steward. I want to take action. I want to do something, and then begin from there.
That's, yeah, I mean,
Can I chip in on
please.
on that to support everything Bernadette's saying, particularly about our relationship with animals, which is obviously a key part of what we do here at Rainforest. I mean, the most devastating deforestation we're seeing in the Amazon rainforest is driven by big agriculture, which is cutting down the rainforest to enormous cattle ranches to supply cheap meat around the world, and then cutting down even more rainforest to grow soya, which is used to feed the cattle. You'd have to think of a policy that was more damaging to the climate than that. So I would say if you want to pick two things to make the most difference, I'd say stop eating meat, or at least reduce the amount of meat you're eating, and fly as little as possible. Those two things are certainly, a key thing to build into your lives. And as Bernadette says, it takes 2 minutes to change to a renewable energy. Every single person out there who does that is helping the solution. Also, I'd also like to add that if people are able to support organisations that are working to provide climate solutions, please do, because lobby organisations, conservation organisations like Rainforest Trust, and many others all need the support of individuals and money to make it happen. It doesn't just happen out of nothing. So if you want to protect existing rainforests, plant new trees, support environmentally friendly farming solutions, etc., please chip in if you can. Here at Rainforest Trust, we've protected 24 million acres of rainforest, which has protected 18 billion trees and stored 4 billion tons of CO2 equivalents. And we couldn't have done any of that without contributions from individuals, organizations, and companies. So, if you can, and I know a lot of people can't, but if you can chip in, then please do. And my final point would be, as I said earlier, just get active in some way. Lobby for positive change, and make sure you're what you're doing counts, because it's up to us to move the conversation forward, and we can only do that by being active.
Thank you, Chris. Some really good points, Alan. Alan, I can see you want to go. Do you have anything you want to chip in on that?
Add to that list about giving people homework to do. I'm sure Bernadette and Chris will be able to, taking those steps will then just ripple into other ones. What I would like to kind of just say is that I think it would be an enormous missed opportunity if we were trying to save the planet to save the status quo. I think the biggest inequity of this whole thing is that the people who are paying the biggest price for climate change are the people who have contributed to it least and have the least resources to fight back against it. And I think that we need to reimagine, as consumers, as individuals, as citizens, a world in which we've saved it for something. Like, we haven't saved it for just to create more inequality in our economy and more human suffering. I think the animal point is possibly, once that clicks with you, there's potentially unlocking all the other things that you could do to create a better world beyond just saving it as well.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Right. And then Tony, final word.
Final word. Well, I liked what everyone just said. So maybe just a practical thing. On the money side, you can switch your bank account really easily. By law, it's all banks have to switch everything in one go very easily, so it's not scary at all. So just bank with Triodos or another green sustainable bank and just move it. And with your pension, if you're lucky enough to have a pension, then write to your pension provider, or if you're in a company that provides a pension, write to your HR department and just demand a net zero emissions pension, and keep writing. And when you get sent a 25-page climate policy document from the pension fund, still write back and say, tell me if my pension is a net zero pension, and don't stop until it is. And just the last thing really is that, we're all very lucky. We're all in jobs. We're all on a call talking about this, but for the very poorest people, this is really difficult. So for very poor people, cheap food feels like the only option. So, we need to think about that as well. And like Alan said, we want a world that's better than the one we've had in the past. And, when we look at the evidence, we've not done well. So let's do it differently, our generation and the next one. Thanks.
Thanks, Tony. And a really, really nice positive note to end on there as well. I think there is the opportunity for us to do better. So I know that we've come to the end of time, but I feel like it's gone really quickly, and we could have spoken about much more, but it just remains to be said, thank you so much to all of our amazing panelists and for your contributions today, and thank you for everyone watching from home. We hope you enjoyed the session, and thank you everyone. Great. I think we're going to part with a friendly wave.
Bye.